for the fifth topic is developed and rich countries have historically contributed more to carbon emissions. They must fully pay for all costs that arise in connection with combating climate change. The first speaker is Joanne Reha Paul from St. John's High School, Bangalore.
Hello, ma'am. Am I visible and heard? Everybody, my name is Reha, and I will be giving the argument for this topic. Now, most of the developed world has developed because of the fact that they've already had access to these resources such as oil and other resources that have been considered harmful and contribute to the amount of CO2 that is found in the atmosphere. Now, most people might suggest that the reason why they still continue to do this for a really long time is because they did not have information to prove that CO2 was in fact harmful for the environment. But there has been a sort of opening or a sort of opening of the eye when people found out that America and many other Western countries and their corporations, such as ExxonMobil, was aware of the damages that oil rigging and as well CO2 had on the environment as early as the 1970s. They still continue to use these sort of resources and still do continue to develop their own countries while also making claims to still be green, or at least greenwashing their countries and their stances. I feel as though the fact that these countries often develop to the exploitation and the use of people from other countries and the land from other countries has been rather tone deaf in a way, after still expecting them to continue to be green, especially these underdeveloped countries such as Indonesia, Bangladesh, and as well as Myanmar. One example of this is of Indonesia, in which Western brands such as Zara and H&M have factories, and where they have polluted a river called as the Chittur River, in which over 1 million Indonesian people live off of and have been poisoned day to day. And many of these underdeveloped countries will face the consequences of these Western countries' action and their lack of control over their corporations and over the actions that their corporations have in other countries. So I believe that the West, and particularly the developed West, have to take the measures to make sure that their companies do not continue to harm underdeveloped countries, and also take full measure and full action for their actions that have heavy consequences for the rest of the world as well. I'm done. Thank you.
All right. Now moving on the same topic against the discussion, we have Sai Jattu from Abu Dhabi Indian School, Branch 1, Al Watba.
Am I clear and audible? Am I clear and visible?
Absolutely.
So I start here. Good evening, esteemed panelists, audiences, and my fellow debaters. I'm Sai Kiran, and I'll be presenting the opposition to the motion. In my speech, I'll be having two major points. One, the historical point of view, and two, the resolution to the problem. Before that, let me start off with an analogy. Imagine you made a mistake completely unknowingly, and later, when you do realize it is a mistake, you work towards undoing it. But you find your friends making the same mistake knowingly and still don't stop. Who is responsible here? Who should be blamed? What if you were made to pay for all the consequences of your friends' mistakes? This is the very motion of today's debate. Let me exemplify how. Here comes my first point. The developed countries did emit CO2 in the past, which was, of course, due to the Industrial Revolution, which had started clearly in the 17th century. But they were completely unaware of the consequences at that time until latest by 19th century, that is around 1970s. After the awareness was spread, developed countries like the USA have worked towards reducing the carbon emissions. According to Statista, the US's carbon emissions have gone down by 5,491 to 5,285 million metric tons from 2009 to 2019. On the other hand, the developing countries like China, India have shown a great increase from 7,800 to 10,500 million metric tons. Here you see the difference. The developed countries have worked towards the environmental consequences, but the developing still commit the same mistake. Now comes the question, who should be blamed? Is it only the developed? Let me answer that. The developed have historically contributed to CO2 emissions, but the developing are currently contributing. So both are liable. According to the Center of Global Development, developing countries like China, India, and others are now contributing even more than US and Japan. US was contributing about 9% before, and now it's China was contributing only 9% before, but now it's contributing 23%. But USA was contributing 25% before, and now it's only 13%. So, hence, I firmly stand on the opposition, asserting that both developed and developing, and not only the developed, should pay for the consequences. Thank you. Here I rest my case.
Thank you. I am going to apologize to the next speaker for mispronouncing the name. It is Shaon Malik.
Yes, ma'am.
Who will be
Am I
speaking.
audible and am I visible?
Yes, Shaon.
Okay, ma'am. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
You build your nation on my bones. You throw your garbage down my stones. You expect me to clean and dry while you nibble at a fish fry. Good evening, everyone. This is the exact philosophy with which the developed first world countries have been operating for more than a century. As the topic suggests, indeed, they are largely responsible for the climate change. Statistics? Okay. The statistics from the Center of Global Development states that from 1850 to 2011, 75% of the carbon emission have been contributed by the first world nations, with the European Union countries alone spewing forth the impressive 40%, while the lesser souls from the developing country like India has contributed only 2%. Well, we would not mind much if they were only dirtying their own country. But the problem is their pollution is directly affecting the life of the poor countries as well. Countries like Bangladesh, Indonesia, and El Salvador face an existential crisis due to the rising ocean levels. And the political instability in the Central America is also a result of the climate change. And then United States will willingly shut its door to the migrants. Where will these people go and how will they survive? My opposition, Sri Jattu, has said that first world nations had realized their mistake. Did they? Out of the $3 billion United States had promised at the Paris conference, they had only donated $1 billion for the cause of tackling climate change. While it is countries like India and China, which has been acclaimed internationally for taking significant steps towards combating the global menace. A very funny thing that I have observed is that in India, we often see that a rich child will throw a plastic wrapper on the street and expect a poor sweeper to clean it. Now, the people from the West come here and lecture us about these social issues while practicing it themselves in a global scale. Also, keep in mind that the civilization of the West is a product of years, centuries of colonialism and oppression on our countries. They have exploited our ancestors, our soil, our resources, and they had built their cars, factories, and Coca-Cola, which had made them earn the honorific title of developed countries. Now, it is their turn to pay the debt of the blood of our ancestors by taking the burden of tackling the climate change and letting the poor nations like us to focus our entire resources towards development and industrialization and let us entry into their prestigious club of the first world countries. This is an obligation, by the way, and not a request. And also, as they're responsible for the majority of the pollution, ours controlling the minute part of it would be just a small kink in the demand-supply curve. But why are they evading this duty? A study by the Stanford University states that due to the global climate change, there will be a northward shift of the productive belt. This means a region as productive and fertile as Gangetic Plain would be formed in the richer and cooler countries of Europe, while countries like India and Bangladesh would be left to die and suffer in the heat. This arises a very sinister question. Is their silence intentional? Then I would like to remind them that if all the people from the poor countries were to collect the dirt and dump it into their nation, their land would be buried under fathoms of dirt. Thank you. Hello, ma'am. I have
Sai
concluded.
Vaishnavi Jattu from Abu Dhabi Indian School Branch 1 Al Watba will be speaking against the topic.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I start. A global problem requires a global solution. The problem is inherently one on which an individual country can make little progress on its own. An effective solution requires that all countries agree to participate together. Good evening, esteemed panelists, audience, and my fellow debaters. I am Sai Vaishnavi and will be representing the opposition on the motion. My speech is mainly divided into 2 points. Firstly, are developed countries enough? Second, the misuse of the funds given to the developing countries. Starting on with my first point, it is simply not possible to create a kind of change we need without involving the developing world. There are approximately 31 developed countries out of 193 countries. So, measures taken by these 16% countries will not be as effective as we need to reduce the carbon production. Going on to my second point, the developing countries will be keeping destroying the climate or be producing the carbon dioxide at the cost of the developed countries. Money or the fund spent by the developed countries might be used by the developing countries to develop themselves or for developing their economy rather than development of the environment or taking environmental precautions. For example, according to Transparency International, some aid was given to Pakistan for the earthquake that took place on October 2005, but Pakistan instead used it for blowing up an aircraft over Atlantic Ocean. Seeing from this example, it is clear that developing countries will rather use the fund given by the developed countries for their own personal use, that is development of the country, than the environment. Hence, all countries should pay or are required to pay for the reduction of carbon emission based on their carbon contribution and their financial condition. When a country is forced to pay for their respective carbon emission, they will itself reduce the carbon emissions or will look for alternative ways. For example, countries will make solar power even more competitive than fossil fuels, hence benefiting the environment. In conclusion, the ultimate aim or goal is to reduce carbon emission for betterment. Thus, we all as united have to work that includes developed and developing countries for a sustainable future. Thank you.
Vini Vikrant Desai from Sharda Mandir School, Goa, will be speaking for the motion.
Am I audible?
Talk again. I think there is a slight
Am
echo.
I audible?
There is a slight echo, Vini.
I hope it's not echoing right now.
Judges, are you all okay with that?
I think if she speaks up a little, we should be okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sure. Please
Am I
continue.
audible?
Yeah, please proceed, Vini.
Please start, Vini.
We can't hear you.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
I believe that there is some network issue or probably something. Vini, can you hear us?
Ma'am, it's breaking.
Just as an exception, may I offer it to the House, and I leave it to the manager, who's Nandini Uchil, and the judges. If Vinny's network, as it is showing its low bandwidth, so only she can be excused to deliver her speech without the camera.
Well, fine. That's fine.
The judges, please.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah,
I think, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, I think we can do that. Yeah.
Sure. Vinny, thank you so much, judges. Vinny, if you want, you can just try delivering your speech without the camera. The House must note that this is a sheer exception to the entire rule. There is some technical glitch, and we're just accounting for that as an aid since we are on a virtual platform.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
I hope I'm audible now.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I can start, right?
Please start.
Humans have emitted about 450 billion tons of carbon since the Industrial Revolution, which has contributed to the world's present climate crisis. Additionally, the dependence on agroeconomy, use of fossil fuels, and industrial activities by developing countries have made huge contributions to increased level of greenhouse gases that have escalated global warming and sponsored a changing climate. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change defined climate change as a change that is distributed directly or indirectly to human activity, altering the composition of the global atmosphere. The changes in climate characteristics that include temperature, humidity, rainfall, and wind, among others, are influenced by natural and human processes over long periods of time. The principal and most abundant greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. Carbon dioxide makes up 60% of the greenhouse gases, which alter the carbon cycle balance. They are emitted into a fragile atmosphere through human activities such as industrialization, burning of fossil fuels, gas flaring, urbanization, and agriculture. They increase global temperatures, thereby disrupting the current socio-economic and environmental processes. A very good evening to everyone. I'm Vini Desai, and I firmly believe that since developed and rich countries have historically contributed more to carbon emissions, they must fully pay for all costs that arise in connection with combating climate change. There is nothing to cheer about in the bluer skies of COVID-19 post-lockdown, but climate change has not stopped. Just a few days ago, the western coast of USA engulfed in massive wildfires woke up to orange skies. Earlier, fueled by the hottest summer on record, the Australian bushfires were raging. The Brazilian fentanyl, the largest wetlands of the world, is burning at an unprecedented rate. The Arctic is on fire too, destroying large peatlands that store carbon, now releasing carbon dioxide, the gas that drives global warming. Global heating and the climate crisis are Israel and here. Who is responsible for this catastrophe? Responsibility is a hot topic in climate change debates. Who is to blame for climate change? Who has the duty to do something about it? These questions are particularly relevant in discussions about climate change mitigation, that is, about who should reduce the carbon emission and by how much. In his address to the COP18 in Doha in December 2012, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stated that, quote unquote, the developed world should bear most of the responsibility for mitigation because the climate change phenomenon has been caused by the industrial age of the developed world. The world is divided on the answer. The current annual emission may point to developing countries as the source of carbon emission. The developed parts of the world or the global north may be reminiscing in a deja vu as they had been there and done that. A recent study using the largest historical data set of emissions has shown that today's economically developed countries of the world are the largest emitters of carbon dioxide, amounting to as much as 92% of the historic emissions. Yet, even as the wealthy nations drive the world towards ecological disaster, it is clearly the poor countries that will face the gravest consequences and have the most difficulty coping. Developed countries have a high responsibility of climate action due to historical emissions. These are also the same countries which have the capacity for greater climate ambition, and they should be leaders of climate action. Such leadership will also allow less developed countries, including war-ravaged ones like Afghanistan, more time to improve living standards of their population. Thank you. I
Thank
hope there
you.
was no voice that was broken. I really don't know.
Sorry,
I hope there was no distortion.
that was fine. That's okay, Vini.
Okay, thank
We'll
you.
now move on to the last speaker in this topic, who's Ananthjith Byju from Abu Dhabi Indian School, Branch 1, Al Watba. He'll be speaking against the motion.
Ma'am, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Money is power. In all cases, whichever bloc or party pays for it will definitely control it. This was quoted by American President Andrew Jackson. Good evening, one and all. Today, I am debating on behalf of Team Opposition, and I firmly believe the motion shouldn't stand. Now, before I jump right in, what do we mean by rich and developed nations? I believe the motion is referring to the countries that have developed sectors and a strong and stable economy. USA, Canada, and members of the European Union are all examples of rich and developed nations. So why shouldn't the rich and developed nations fully pay to combat climate change? Number one, because if they are made to pay for combating climate change on behalf of the whole world, they'll have complete control over it, and the whole effort will be overseen and executed by them and them only. How is that a bad thing? The effort won't have any input from the developing and underdeveloped countries, and they are the ones that need this the most. Without any contribution or physical input from them, what's stopping the R&D nations from misusing or abusing their influence to save themselves rather than the rest of the world? You may be thinking to yourselves, no, they won't do that. They have a moral obligation, right? Truth is, in the world we live in right now, moral obligation has no meaning. A pertinent example of this is the 2010 and 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. R&D nations had pledged to donate 100 billion to the Green Climate Fund in the UN. 3 years later, findings revealed that these so-called rich and developed nations had fallen behind their pledge and had only coughed up 10 billion, hardly 1/10 of the original 100 billion target. Months later, President Trump declared that he was pulling out. The USA, who had spearheaded the whole initiative, pulled out with no consequences whatsoever, and they hardly made a dent. The only nations that ever got anything out of this were the ones that contributed to combating climate change, with the non-contributing nations, that is the developing and underdeveloped nations, getting nothing. In conclusion, the developed countries have proved time and time again that they can't take up this fight themselves. So the others are forced to take matters into their own hands as they are the ones suffering. The only option they have is to contribute whatever they can afford to ensure that they actually have a chance of survival and to not end up getting even more violated or defiled. Because if we can learn anything from the Paris, Warsaw, or Kyoto protocols, it is that politicians and bureaucrats of these so-called developed countries have no hesitation or shame in fiddling even when the world burns apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananthjith. Now, all contestants for this topic have 30 seconds to decide if they want to rebuttal. We have received a couple of requests, but if there are any other requests, we'll be happy to take them. If anyone wants to withdraw at this point of time, that's acceptable too. Your time begins now. All right. We have the first rebuttal from Sai Vaishnavi Jattu.
Am I audible?
Yes.
So I would like to ask the speaker one from the proposition side. The question is, both developed as well as developing countries are producing carbon emissions at a greater height that affects the underdeveloped countries. So why just the developed countries are supposed to pay all the costs? Why not developing and develop both?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. So, why I believe the developed countries have to pay more is because a large amount of the emissions come from them. A majority of the corporations that do make these emissions, right? All these wealthy companies and like Amazon, for example, and also again I told Zara H&M. So most of these companies are from the developed world, and they make the most amount of these emissions. And I believe because of that, the wealthy developed countries should be the one taking responsibility for their corporations' actions as well. If that helps.
Thank you. We now move on to the second contestant, who is Sai Jattu.
I'd like to ask the question to proposition second speaker, Shaon. I'm sorry if I pronounced the name wrong.
Shaon, yeah.
Okay. So my question will be basically the source that you have mentioned, which is Center of Global Development. The statistics that I read just today morning is that only the European Union, that is only 9% their contribution to the global contribution to CO2 is only 9%. And the whole global, the developing countries as a whole are contributing at about 63%, which is even more than any other countries, developed or underdeveloped countries. So if they have more than 50% contribution to the whole carbon emission, why aren't they also supposed to pay for the consequences?
May I answer?
Yes.
So Saikiran, I have listened to your question. I think the statistics you are referring is the statistics in the recent years. This is the more modern trend. What I have referred is the average statistics from 1850 to 2011. So they have to be made responsible for the crimes they had committed in past also. No? If someone has murdered somebody 10 years back, so even if he's now caught, he will face the dire consequences in the Greek court. Thank you. That was my question.
Can I have a answer to that, or no, it's not allowed?
Sorry, Sai,
Okay.
we are not allowing a counter. All right. Thank you so much. Shaon, I believe you have a rebuttal point to one of your peers.
Yes, ma'am. My question is to the second speaker of the opposition, I believe, Sai Vaishnavi Jattu.
Yeah, Sai Vaishnavi Jattu, right?
Yes, ma'am. So my question to you is: can all the developing countries be generalized by the negative example of Pakistan, where there are positive example of the Indian Prime Minister receiving the CERAVIC Global Energy and Environment Leadership Award due to commitment towards sustainable development? Thank you.
The example that I have given is just a cause, or you can say is a misuse. Thus, we can conclude that the countries can misuse or will misuse. On that, we cannot generalize that only developed countries are supposed to pay. Currently, developing countries are producing carbon emissions even higher than developed countries. Thus, both are supposed to be paying, not just the developed countries, if that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ananthjith,
Ma'am,
do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. I would like to ask my question to speaker number 2. Is that okay? Because he had
Yes,
answered.
but may I request you all to turn on your cameras?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. And so your speaker number 2 would be Sai Vaishnavi, is it?
No, ma'am.
He's
sorry.
from the opposition.
So Shaon.
Yeah. First of all, hey, ma'am. So you said that you stated that in the Paris Agreement, USA only paid 1 billion out of the 3 billion they promised to pay, right? And and in my speech, I mentioned that they got away with it without facing any consequences. So my question is, so if USA, they lead in the list of developed countries, if USA can't pay 1/3 of the funds they promised, isn't that a testament on how developed countries can't keep their promises, and hence the developing countries have to pay so that they can look out for themselves in the future? Isn't that a testament to that?
Yeah, it is true that the developing countries, the developed countries like evading their duty, but there can be a international court constituted, just like the USA constituted a court to try the Japanese prisoners of war in the World War II. So we can also constitute a environmental court, and that will oblige the United States to pay the money, or they will face consequences.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions and your rebuttals. With this, we conclude the second last topic for the evening.